this elective is about writing a planless AF. So hopefully you're in the right place for that. Few things before I get started. I'll have a couple of things to say, just like thinking strategically about how to write one. But I also want this to be relatively interactive. I know, planless affirmatives, when we write them tend to be near and dear to our heart. So we probably have different ideas of what we want to say. So I do want to sort of like hear some of your ideas. I'm happy to give some input, how you might start constructing some of those ideas and talk through them in addition to just sort of talking. So we're going to do a little bit of both. So the way that I sort of like to start a selective is sort of start by talking about what not to do. Okay, what not to do. You might have, how many of you have debated a critical affirmative that has no plan? Okay, so most of you. It's like some affirmatives are quite good. They're meaningful. They're, sophisticated. They have some strategic merit. Like they're good. Some are not so good. So like some are sort of like half-baked ideas that got put in one AC and then like, here we go, right? So a couple things that you sort of want to avoid when writing a planless affirmative. So like the first thing is you should not decide to read a planless affirmative because you think it's easy, okay? I think a lot of times people will be like, let me just take the plan out so that we don't debate, as difficult positions or as many positions in the 1NC. It usually works out for teams that are trying to go like 2-4 or 3-3. But like after that point, you'll get deleted by teams with moderate competence on framework, right? So I think the thing that's sort of important about a planless affirmative is that a lot of your work happens in the preseason and a lot more than you might for just sort of a normal policy strategy. It requires a lot of reading. Like you have to be able to sound intelligent on the thing you're talking about, especially since you're transgressing some of the norms that people find near and dear to their heart. Like you kind of need to have a compelling story for why you're doing that. And it also requires you to craft sort of a vocabulary that, both works in terms of the, source material we're reading, but also vocabulary that people can flow, that people who have not read your stuff still know kind of what's going on, right? So it is a pretty difficult thing to do. The second is you should not try to make a square peg fit in a round hole, okay? And by that I mean, many of you when writing critical affirmatives will like start with a theory you like and then try to like jam it into the topic. So those AFs tend to have a pretty tenuous relationship with things like NATO or emerging technology. So it's like if I'm like, I really like reading about psychoanalysis, and it's like I'm going to jam psychoanalysis into the topic. It's like that tends to not be that successful because when debating things like read it on the net or arguments about why the ballot is important, you don't really have a reason why your thing is important for the topic, right? You just sort of have like a collection of theories, okay? The third sort of what not to do thing is that you should not be the team that sort of reads the same affirmative, or sorry, like new affirmatives, but with the same 2 AC. So there's like a trope of critical team that like will break something new in every debate, call it something totally obnoxious and new on the wiki. Like I think you know who I'm talking about. Like whenever you'll put something, it'll be like interesting psychoanalysis version 1, and then like the second one will be like thought process version 2. It's like no, like that doesn't really do anything for you either, because it's like if the 2 AC is the same, right? Think about it this way: most teams that are debating your 1 AC are not coming up with crazy innovative strategies. They're just going to say topicality, capitalism, and case. So it's like, given that if your 2 AC is identical, their 2 NC is also going to be already prepared, right? So it doesn't make sense to just be like, oh yeah, I have a new 1 AC. It's like we need like a new affirmative strategy when you're writing. Okay. Now that we talked a little bit about that, let's chat a little bit about how to start. Okay, how to start researching a planless AF. So step 1. You should read some topic articles and then think of theories that might work. So you should read topic articles and then think of theories that might work. Usually sort of my suggestion is to start with things that don't really look like cards, things that look more like historical surveys, and then sort of look through footnotes of things that you might find interesting. So, on this topic in particular, it's like there's a pretty, significant history of how security cooperation has evolved since like World War II through the Cold War to now. There's quite a few articles that talk about the history of NATO. My guess is that those fall off the page, right? In terms of the creation of the idea of an Atlantic community, right after World War II, and its relationship to things like race, gender, et cetera. So it's like starting with some of those historical tidbits and knowing things about the topic putting some of those things in the 1AC enlivens your 1AC quite a bit. So it's like, I would start with like the history and sort of like read through it and see like what things like really catch your eye and interest you. So don't start with the theory, start with like reading about the topic, okay? The second thing that you sort of want to do is once you've sort of read, topic articles, the next thing you want to do is to maybe think about sort of like what area of study the thing might really correspond to. So, here's one idea that I know for sure exists. It's like there's, a set of articles that say, the issue with, NATO is that it presumes sort of a universal community of the Atlantic, or presumes sort of like the North Atlantic is sort of the paragon for civilization. Okay. And there are a set of articles that are relating it, so I know for a fact, like there's a set of articles that are related to like Asian minority stuff and say things like are sort of propping up of NATO as an idea is sort of, and sort of correlation, there's sort of a relationship with CETO, you might not have known. We did try to create something called the like Southeast Asian NATO Treaty Organization, basically, right? Called CETO, SEATO. And there's some articles that are just like, the reason why sort of CETO failed conceptually is because, it didn't have sort of that same idea of like a white European universal sort of civilization, and it kind of fell apart because of sort of the way that some, European officials, for example, treated the people who were in Asia. It's like that treaty kind of fell apart. It fell apart pretty quickly. NATO, on the other hand, has continued, and maybe for a particular reason, right? There are also, a set of articles in relationships like NATO and colonials. So it's like the thing that I'm sort of getting at here is like once you've seen the articles, it's like what areas of study might this intersect with? So it's like my guess is that if you're looking at some cards that are talking about NATO and colonialism, it's like there's a larger, set of conversations happening about colonialism more broadly and also in a European context. So it's like start with history, then sort of start thinking about the theory. Then the next, third step is to collect cards, and you should collect cards no matter how random they seem. So I think the sort of struggle with planless affirmatives a lot of times is that you'll look at something and you'll be like, this may be interesting, but I don't know if it's a card. Like it might just be like a bunch of history and you'll be like, what could this possibly be? But you should sort of go back and remember and be like, when you're writing a 1AC for a planless affirmative, it's not like every card is like a causal thing. It's like, the plan solves X, X causes extinction. It's like, that's not really what's happening, right? And especially if your affirmative is focused on history, it's like the historical claims are important in your 1AC. So it's like, you should process the card, even if you're like, I'm not sure if I'm ever going to use this. One sort of, example of this, like I, oftentimes write all of the planless affirmatives for North Broward. It's like, I definitely last year had sort of a 1AC. I didn't have a critical team, which is not great. But, I did have like an article that was sitting around about like Baltimore and like basically like water protectors in Baltimore, and was like, I don't know what this could possibly be useful for. But it ended up like I ended up writing a 1AC that like had to do with Black geography, sort of the relationship between like Baltimore water protectors and that. It's like initially I was like, what am I really reading? Like, what is this? But it's like it did end up into a 1AC, right? So it's like you should always keep some of these historical artifacts so that you can sort of use them in sort of future projects. Okay, so you've started. Now you have some cards, hopefully. The next set of things that you kind of do is pick a method. Okay, you should pick a method. When you're picking a method, you should see sort of what your best articles say. So just like an affirmative that has a plan, your affirmative is likely to have some kind of solvency advocate, right? And the solvency advocate should say a couple things. Your solvency advocate should say something about NATO. Okay, should say something about NATO. And it should say something about sort of the nature of emerging technology. Okay, so it should say something about NATO, and it should say something about emerging tech. I think one of the pitfalls for this year is that folks will write 1ACs, they'll just be like, NATO, real bad organization, very European, period. It's like, and it's like, that's not a very good strategy for the topic, because it's like, much of sort of the mechanism of the plan has to do with what NATO does with emerging technology. Right. So it's like, even if it's true, like, yes, you're right. Like NATO, for example, its relationship with Africa, not good. Like lots of interventions that were pretty violent went very poorly. That doesn't really have a huge relationship with like what is NATO doing with, like, for example, or a cyber or AI policy, right? And a lot of teams will likely say something like that's, either just a negative argument. It's like that's probably the common retort if it's a topicality argument, or they might literally just be like, our TVA sort of accounts for that and tries to, reduce the reach of NATO. So like an example might be, if I was debating topicality against a NATO bad style affirmative, I would likely say something like the TVA is to, have the US and NATO ban laws, right? Lethal autonomous weapons, right? The reason why that's like kind of powerful in this case is like your AF can clearly say NATO bad and then restrain its military, operations. So it's like you need something that is also a critique of sort of dealing with emerging technology as well, not just NATO. Okay. It should not be the case that you have one link card to the topic. So I think this is also like a version of a critical AF that tends to usually be pretty bad, is like, you were like, all right, so I really want this affirmative to be about like DDIs. And it's like, okay, let me find the one article that says the word security cooperation and DDIs in it. That'll be card number one. Rest of the affirmative, same from last year. It's like, that's usually also sort of a failing strategy for the same sort of reasons I talked about before, which is like, if you don't have a really good tie to emerging technology and you don't have like a coherent story, there's not really a reason why your thing is key on your topic. I think that's fairly apparent. The second sort of thing that you want to do when you're picking a method is that you should think about language that you can lift. Okay, and I think this is pretty important. So, when you're writing a planless affirmative, there's a number of concepts that you want to employ that you want to repeat throughout the debate. So, like for example, like for the TOC 2 years ago, I had written an affirmative about Black trans life and its relationship to the criminal justice system. And one of like the phrases that they used in that piece of evidence was like the trans tipping point. It was kind of like the premise that essentially anytime we would try to sort of regulate bodily, autonomy and behavior, that it would result in a set of impacts. It's like that language of trans tipping point was something that featured in all of our impact statements, right? So it's like that sort of helps the judge like figure out the language that you might have that's specific to, your 1AC and scholarship, even if they haven't read that scholarship. Does that kind of make sense? Do you have a question?
What do you mean by this?
So it's like there's a set of vocabulary words that your author or your articles will use that like kind of can serve as an enthymeme. An enthymeme is basically like a shortened version of your argument that will sort of like inspire in the judge sort of the idea of the thing you're saying. So like, for example, for NATO, let's say your big critique is of Atlanticism, or like the idea of a white Atlantic. It's like the phrase white Atlantic can feature multiple times in the 1AC. It should feature in the description of your impact. It should feature in things like solvency deficits to the critique, right? So it's like you want to pick some words where you're like, oh, this is like, catchy enough, easy to flow, like people can remember it. And the thing that's sort of important about those vocab words is that it can't be like something that's like totally unflowable and like incomprehensible, right? So like the like bad version of this is like, let's say you're reading some postmodern stuff and like you found like a German word, like Gelassenheit. It's like, yeah, that's not getting flowed. Like that's not your keyword, right? It's like you want to find some language that's like, oh, this is like pretty accessible. And when I think of the word, it's pretty apparent what I'm trying to say. So it's like the nice thing about like the phrase white Atlantic, it's like, even if you haven't read any of this literature, it's like you have a pretty good idea that's like, oh, like I kind of know what you're talking about, even though there's no further description. Like that's kind of the goal for like vocabulary that you're trying to take out of an article. Okay, so yeah, so a couple of sort of ways that you might think about writing a planless affirmative. So at least for me, the way that you should, think about it is once you've done your topic survey and you have like a bunch of historical examples you want to use and whatnot, the next step is to sort of think about what your most common 2ARs are, okay? And so here's a non-exhaustive list. It's like probably in about 75% of your debates, the 2NR is topicality, okay? There's a couple of versions of topicality, so it's not always the same. There's topicality arguments that are focused on things like procedural fairness. So like you broke the rules, that's bad, you should lose. There's versions of topicality that are focused on clash. So it's like the process of learning through a limited topic allows us to learn stuff better. Obviously there's more to that, but it's like that's conceptually the case. And there's topicality arguments about skills. So they'll be like, you should learn more about state action. It teaches us to infiltrate, sabotage, whatever word you want to include in there. And like we become better policy people. Okay. So that's like thing one. That's like 70% of your 2NRs. Like 20% of your 2NRs are the cap K. The cap K usually is one of two things. They'll either be like, you weren't materialist enough, you used language, right? So it's like you focused on language and performance and culture, and that's not material. And the other version of the cap K is you didn't use the state. So it's like, usually this is like the state phobia critique, right? It's like not using the state means that we can't secure things like distribution of resources properly. It, can't solve global warming, et cetera. And then the remaining 10% I kind of put as et cetera, but like usually it's like in the, I'm gonna call this like commodification. So like these are cards that are like the ballot fails, like you do this to win. You don't really care about the thing. Maybe, people watching your thing will commodify your thing. Maybe, the way that you use suffering representations were not very good. I like to put this in sort of the same column because it's like usually the set of arguments that's just like, you really want to do something, but kind of the opposite happens because like you didn't anticipate the fact that people will like take your performance and do things with it. So it's like, that's usually the rest of the 10%. That's pretty much exhaustive of a lot of the 2NRs. There are some others, obviously, like some people have very specific strategy against critical affirmatives, but I'd say few and far between, okay? And I think if you've read a critical F, that's probably likely been similar to your experience as well. Given that, it's like, you want to sort of think about what kind of team you are debating and write a planless affirmative based on that idea. So a few examples, that I'm going to sort of put out there. I have like 3, okay? The first is, TOC finals 2019. So like we're debating a team from Montgomery Bell. They were quite good, Aiden Barton and Julian Haberman. Their strategy on the negative was pretty consistent. It was always topicality with a clash argument, and then a bunch of case cards, and that was it. When we were thinking about putting together an AF, we were like, what sort of the big strength that this team has? And the thing that they were really good at was explaining the impact of clash. So they were really good at being like, clash, helps you learn stuff. Unlimited means you don't learn anything. You don't learn about your AF. And like, we lost like maybe 6 debates during the season for this team, like up until the TOC final. And so we were like, okay, so we need to write an affirmative that starts with the premise that like we solve clash, or else we're just going to lose this debate. And so we went back to some of the historical stuff and we're like, something that might be different about a way that we could, talk about a critical AF is instead of just trying to impact her in clash or impact her in the topicality argument, that we could try to link turn it and say we mean, okay? And so we were like, let's write an affirmative that, that basically ends up in the 2AR asserting that we meet the resolution. And we're like, how do we get to that? We're like, okay, so like maybe we rewrite the affirmative, plain text in a different language that's not just like nuclear English. And we're like, okay, so like that is the final conclusion. And then it's like, we're like, okay, so like to get to that conclusion, what would our 2AC block need to look like? And then what would our 1AC need to look like? So it wasn't just like historical example 1AC, it was like, this is the strategy that's going to end up in the final portion of the debate. Here's how I write the affirmative, from sort of like back to front, okay? Another example, we debated a Bellarmine team like 2 years ago that was pretty good, HM. They also destroyed us for most of the season. Their, framework argument was more focused on skills. So their like whole spiel was like, the state's great and like we need to learn about it, or else like, what are we really doing in the activity? And then they had a bunch of impact arguments associated. We had put together like some cards that were in the context of race that basically were like, when non-Black people tell Black folks that they need to labor for their freedom, it's kind of messed up. And that Black folks should get the choice to either labor for their freedom or, if they choose not to. And so like, we're like, yeah, that's like pretty persuasive and like kind of new. And like, we had a set of cards that were pretty new and we're like, that sounds pretty good. And we're like, how do we get there? And so we were like, we started with the 2AR and like, I started to think about different like theories that might get us there. And then we ended up in the 1AC, like, I didn't really think this was going to happen, but the 1AC ended up being about Black Buddhism, which is like really random, like came from kind of nowhere, but we were like, well, we did like, I don't think I would have gone there by being like, let me start with the 1AC. Like there was probably no chance that I would have gotten to that conclusion, but I did start with the 2AR. I was like, this team reads a set of state good arguments. Here's the best sort of critiques that I can think of. let me now trace it back to the 1AC based on some of the historical examples that we might have that if we've like produced in a processed file. Okay. Final one, TOC quarters, like we debated a team that like to go for like the sabotage stuff. We're like, we're like, okay, we need some answers to sabotage. We looked at the answers. We're like, the best set of arguments are like militants don't like it very much. So that resulted in like the race war F. So like we kind of went like from the 2AR back. It's like the thing that's really nice about sort of that kind of strategy is that it helps you have a bunch of different affirmatives, but it also helps you have like a pretty coherent story throughout. It's really doable in the context of a planless affirmative because a lot of teams, you know for a fact what their position is before you have entered the room. So it's like you look on their wiki and they're like, what is your past 2 NRs against K teams? And it'll be like T, 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 or like we go for the cap K, like religiously. And usually the thing that sort of happens there is it's not just the position. You also know like who is going to give the speech. So it's like they're only going for the stuff the 2NC goes for example. And it's like they literally never go for the stuff the 1NR goes for. That tends to be structurally the case, right? Because like the 2N has thought about their negative strategy usually the most, and then the 1N is like, I'm here for the ride, like I'm here to read the 1NC, and like I'm here to fill 5 minutes down. Like, don't blame me that I don't know anything. Like that's usually the case in most of these critical AF debates. So it's like it's very transparent what is about to happen to you, and it's like if that's the case, then you should be able to preempt like versions of affirmative that sort of respond to specific things really well. As a sort of related to that. Some affirmatives are better at answering certain off case positions than others. Okay. Some affirmatives are better at answering certain off case positions than others. So like, in my opinion, like when we're reading the we meet version of the AF, we were really quite scared that MBA would decide not to read Topicality because we were like, we defend the plan. So we were like, what happens when MBA reads like the state's counter plan and the politics dissad? Like, is that a quick fold? And we were like, that would be pretty rough. Right. So it's like, but we kind of banked on the idea that was like, this team will for sure only read Topicality. Literally could not matter less what we did. And it's like that guess paid off. Similarly, it's like, the race war affirmative that we had was pretty good against sabotage. Against other positions, it's like against the ballot K, like I would have been a little bit more concerned because it's like, there's not really much going on there that ties debate to militancy or like the academy to militancy that's any good. So it's like different AFs have sort of different strengths and weaknesses to positions. And the way that you should sort of write your affirmative is that you might have multiple versions of an affirmative or multiple affirmatives that have sort of different takes on each of these positions that you can read and sort of, have, right? And when I sort of talk about this, I don't mean like you literally have to start from scratch, right? Like in our context, much of the set of things that we worked on because, of the team's interest was about race. And so we had like a bunch of different styles of arguments related to race. That doesn't need to be the case. Like that could be the case with gender. There's also quite a few waves of, feminism, quite a few waves of people who disagree. Same with like things like settler colonialism. It's like, it's not literally all the same. Not everybody believes exactly the same thing. So it's like, if you're like, I'm really interested in this area of study, it's like, there are multiple ways that you can deploy your thing that does work quite well. So like, to give an example so we did have another team that was very interested in settler colonialism. We had like a couple of different AFs. We had one that was more or less just giving the land back. That seemed pretty good against like people who defended the state, but like not that great on Topicality because they would just say read on the neg and we would be sent home. We had like another set of like indigenous, philosophers that were talking about like indigeneity and Baudrillard. It's like that was actually pretty good against like the Academy K and the ballot K and like Topicality. Less good at like when the neg was like the state's good, like don't do anything. We're like, yeah, we probably don't. But like it does avoid some of the core like Topicality presses that we were largely concerned about, right? So it's like that's kind of the way that we like tweaked some of our affirmatives to respond to certain positions. And then we like picked the AF based on where like predictions of what the 2NR was going to be. Do you have a question? They could. Usually the thing with like the mind games version of it though is that they are not like they're playing mind games themselves because they're not prepared. So it's like a lot of the times it's like if you think about just the neg work that you're doing, right? It's like the topic this year is so big that it's pretty difficult to be like, I'm going to write a very specific case negative versus K teams to every K team. Like that's just generally true of most high school topics. And that kind of means like the way that, you know, I don't know if you're a 2N or 2A, but like 2Ns oftentimes will just be like, here are a bunch of conceptual ideas that I'm going to consistently read this position against. So like even against policy teams, like this year, I would probably not recommend being like literally write 1,000 case notes. It's like, it's probably impossible unless, you know, a lot of these AFs just have the same 4 concepts, which they might. I'll probably disagree myself in the writing a case night lecture tomorrow. But it's like, my guess is that you're probably going to be like, all right, so like if things go wrong, the break glass positions are like these generics, right? So it's like, I have the DOS counterplan or the Verily okay or whatever, if I don't have a specific strategy against that. Similar thought about KAPs, it's like pretty difficult to be like, we have things like constantly, right? So it's like, they will likely invest in the set of topicality. Usually the K is the place where people are like a little different and like depends on the school. So it's like some people really like CAP, some people really like psychoanalysis, some people really like Baudrillard modification stuff. You can kind of tell just based on like what they've read in the past, like what that position is going to be. That's not topicality. And then like the rest of the positions usually are filler bad. So it's like they say hedge good. It's like AF says no link, debate went nowhere. They say like object-oriented ontology. You say, huh? And then literally does not end up in the 2 and R, right? It's like, that's usually kind of the case. Sometimes gambles, you know, don't pay off, but at the same time, it's like, the more you like sort of like look at people's wikis, the more you're like kind of tracking what's going on, the easier it is to sort of like figure out what their ATK team strategy is. Yeah, most people are not. And then the other thing for me is like, you can also bait a specific strategy. So like, this is really, so like when we were coaching this team, George and Nick, who like did quite well, they would sort of do this thing where they would look at people's wiki and see what they read against other like K teams. So like, for example, we usually read arguments about race, but like this particular team, we looked at their wiki and we saw that they had debated a settler colonialism affirmative before, and we saw like this was the one in C. We were like, we're reading a new AF. We broke a settler colonialism AF. Sure enough, they read the exact same one on C, right? And we're like, yeah, we like before this debate wrote out the entire 2AC to everything. So like debate's over, right? And like the thing that like is illustrative there is like, you know, it's in this case, it's like saying new AF means that they have no prep. And so we like kind of were like, okay, that means that they're just going to literally use the last one on C because like they don't have anything else. Like they have to figure it out in the 1AC with a lot of time pressure, right? And we're like, that means that that's just going to result in a 2AC that looks identical. And then like we'd written out the entire 2AC and then they were like, oh, well, you know, fold. So it's like predictions usually are pretty good on like, especially KAPs. It's a little bit harder to do with plans because it's like counter plans are different. People like different stuff. Teams tend to be a little bit more flexible with policy debates. Like they'll be like, oh yeah, like this disad is going better than the counter plan. With K debates, it's like most people specialize like almost immediately. So it's like, they'll be like, this year we're going for the cap. And it's like, you'll notice like every team, like, so like GN, like that I coach right now, it's like every debate is top down. Like there might be 9 positions, but the 2 and R is top down. So it's like, okay, well, that's pretty easy to figure out what it's going to be. If that makes sense. Cool. What else? Okay. Thinking about topicality. So, you know, I think this is probably the thing that, you know, your AF is most concerned about, if I had to guess. I think when thinking about T and having a planless affirmative, it's really, really important to have a coherent strategy. Okay, it's really, really important to have a coherent strategy. The 2AC that you have for topicality should not be like 12 dissociated impact turns and then a bunch of really bad defense like we had our stuff on the wiki and like, you know, fast teams disprove fairness and like we're a small school. It's like that's the set of things that teams are most ready to respond to, right? It's like they're both simultaneously not very good and it's like they have blocks. Like no one is surprised by like, you know, small school D. It's like that doesn't really do very much, right? The second is you want to sort of think about the kind of T team they are. So it's like, this is sort of what differentiates the teams who are mid-level K teams that like don't advance and then like the top. So it's like having different blocks for the 2AC. So you should not just have a block that's titled 2AC dash topicality. It's like you will lose all of your debates, or you'll lose all of your debates past 3-3. Okay. You want to sort of have modularized blocks. So like you might have a top level 2AC to topicality that responds to a certain set of definitions. You should also have 2ACs to specific standards, right? So you should have a 2AC to fairness that has whatever stuff that you're going to say about fairness. You should have a 2AC to clash and iterative testing. You should have a 2AC to, like people who are like dogmatism. Like that's a Bellarmine favorite. It's like you should have some 2AC stuff for that, 2AC to skills. So it's like you want to sort of have different 2ACs based on the kinds of standards people will read, because the character of that topicality debating changes pretty radically, right? So it's like the T team that's like, we're not just saying follow the rules, we're saying like state skills gives you a set of, ways to become a better subject, right? That's like focused on, that concedes a lot of the affirmative arguments about subject formation, but internal link turns the app, right? Versus a fairness argument that's like, only fairness matters, like the debate is a competition and you don't form subject. There's a pretty radically different 2 and C, because it's basically cutting the affirmative off at sort of the solvency section and then saying none of your stuff is solved anyway, fairness is the only impact. So it's like the 2AC that you would give to either of those things is pretty different, right? So it's like for the skills thing, it's like they have granted you some of your subject formation stuff, but you need to do some like impact work that describes why your impact outweighs some of the skills that are generated by learning about the state. Or if it's fairness, it's like you probably need to win some of your subject formation stuff back again. Fairness is not a huge impact, right? So it's like if we're weighing like racism and fairness, it's like, yeah, like one of those things is probably a lot worse than the other, right? But it's like you kind of need to get to that position, and it's like that means you need to like win some of your claims that are like the ballot is important, disruption of debate is important, that's like set of impacts that are associated with that. The third idea about thinking about T is you should think about the approach that your article seem to conclude for. Okay, the approach that your article seems to conclude for. Some articles tend to be very antagonistic, right? They're like, we hate everything about civil society, NATO, etc. So that strategy of 1AC would likely impact your everything, right? Some, articles might not be like total overhaul. We just need to expand our knowledge about a certain area. It's like, that's probably one that has a counter interpretation that's like slightly more expansive, but probably doesn't impact her everything, right? Or, this is sort of a fringe case, but it's like your evidence says that like it's not the content that's the issue, but the form in which it's presented, perhaps language. It's like that probably is more of a we meet style article. So it's like thinking about like what your articles, are conducive to as a strategy, and then planning your response to topicality that way is pretty important when you're putting together sort of a planless affirmative, right? And that's sort of like a key part of all this. Okay, I know I've talked at you for a little while. Do folks have either any questions, or would people like some ideas about sort of like planless affirmatives for the year, or do people want to sort of like test ideas and have a combo? Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Okay. So when I say like your 1AC should be responding to framework, I don't mean like have a framework in 1AC per se. And I don't think that's what you want to do. You sort of want like, you want to have sort of a cohesive story that you're telling about the 1AC that transposes pretty well with the set of things you're saying on T. So like, for example, let's say we're doing the Atlantic community thing, like white Atlantic bad, maybe we should have black or red Atlantic, right? A red Atlantic, by the way, in this context, not about indigeneity, it's about Marxism. It's about like the Cold War. By the way, if you do search those things, you will come up with a bunch of articles. I would be like, if I had an F about the white Atlantic, a lot of those scholars are not Afro-pessimists. They are somewhere in the middle. Like they just kind of think that the white Atlantic has been exclusive, establishes a certain norm of universality that perhaps is not true, and that we need to sort of critique that. So given that, it's like, okay, so Our topicality arguments then probably are not going to be like, we should never talk about NATO, right? It's like the whole point of the white Atlantic, black Atlantic stuff is like, we should talk about the Atlantic. We should be more critical about the way that we've only focused on, relationships between, Europe, right? So it's like, that's probably the way that I'm thinking about the counter interpretation. The impact turn probably echoes the same language that I'm talking about in terms of, establishing white Atlantic as universal. It's like, you might be able to say something like, there is a relationship between the white Atlantic posing itself as a universal civilization and the white debate community establishing itself as a universal in terms of the set of debate arguments that are considered traditional, right? It's like, then it's like, I've created a fairly cohesive story and analogy between the two things that then it lets me establish a set of impact arguments. So remind me what the AFF that you all are working on is again. I know like vaguely about borders. That's kind of the only information I have. Mhm. Mhm. Okay. So what is sort of your solvency advocate people say that we should do about that? Cool. Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, like, just like what, like, sort of like pops out at me in terms of like, we talked a little bit about like pulling out language. It's like that Fortress Europe language sounds pretty good in terms of being like, Fortress Europe tries to establish, what it means to be European, to the exclusion of those that it considers not sufficiently European, right? It's like, that probably has a relationship to topicality. It's like topicality also establishes a kind of intellectual fortress that, establishes what is normatively acceptable, what is not acceptable, what is tradition, what is not tradition, right? So it's like, you can sort of establish a set of link arguments sort of based on that. I don't think that, so it's like, when I say that, I don't mean the 1AC should forefront that immediately. So it doesn't need to be that like the 1AC is like, oh yeah, it's like, let me show you all my tricks. Like Fortress Europe is like Fortress Debate, like vote AFF, right? It's like, you can kind of use that, that sort of cohesive story and history in the 1AC, and then the 2AC be like, here's kind of the tie and relationship to it, and I think that's kind of the way that you want to approach that. I would say, considering the version of your AF that's like maybe anti-borderization, it might be a little bit more in the impactor and antagonistic direction, right? So like, it would be pretty weird to be like, okay, so like now my 2AC is counter-interp, like discussion of the topic. It's like, I thought the whole point of your AF is that we shouldn't have borders. And so like, it might be that your AF is more focused on just like borderization of intellectual inquiry bad. Like, and we're just gonna impact on everything you say. Fairness, not really an impact. It really is a way to sort of establish procedural borders over stuff. That's bad. It outweighs, right? It's like, that's kind of has to be the strategy that you have, I think. You might be something slightly different if your solvency advocate says something, a little bit, less sort of like no borders ever. But it's like, that's kind of the way that you want to sort of trace the way that you want to talk about stuff. Hmm? I think there's probably quite a few things that like work. So I think like the first one that's the easiest is this like idea of critique of Atlantic is kind of like the way that I put this. And the sort of thing that I like about it is that there's a bunch of different scholars that write pretty different things. So like white Atlantic, black Atlantic. So like the person that's famous for talking about that is Paul Gilroy. He writes a book about sort of black diaspora and sort of the relationship between, the Atlantic and, just like conceptually speaking, right? Like the way that I would sort of talk about this is the topic literally only thinks the Atlantic is like the European northern half of it and ignores all of the South American and or African version of the Atlantic. And it's like, we need to have more sort of broad discussions of Atlanticism. It's kind of important. So it's like, there's a version that talks about that. There's also a version of the Red Atlantic, which is in relationship to the Cold War. There's probably a pretty large historical deep dive you can do there about the relationship between NATO and communism, obviously, right? And you can have sort of a discussion that's like, we need to sort of think about Red Atlantic that sort of unites populist fronts as opposed to one that just sort of talks about the larger institutions. So it's like that probably exists. The CEDAW Asian model minority thing was only one article that I found. I was kind of interested in it, but that exists too. So like if you do like NATO, CEDAW, like Asian, white civilization, like you'll probably find some articles. There's probably some stuff that talks about the relationship between security cooperation and emerging technology and colonialism. So, my guess is that, doing even the settler colonialism search in relationship to that, there will be some articles that exist there. I know for a fact that at least one does, using the phrase security cooperation, NATO, and the phrase settler colonialism. There's, I'd say another sort of area would be a larger critique of technology, not just in the context of like critique like Virilio or some of the tech case stuff, but like an AFF that maybe focuses on why debates over technology are problematic, and maybe some of those technologies have been disseminated and are pervasive in the human experience, and also maybe also show themselves in debate as well in ways that we should critique. And so there's probably like a set of affirmatives that criticize the idea of cybernetics in the context of both the sort of attempt to automate NATO, but also in terms of the attempt to maybe automate our responses in debate. Like we expect things that are predictable, that are easy to sort of comprehend, that are traditional, so that our outputs can be predictable, etc. And it's like we have a larger critique of that based in technology that might exist. So it's like there's a number of things that exist, I think. The thing that you want to really think about, though, is that you want to make sure that your AF doesn't just end up being a negative argument. So the thing you really want to avoid is you want to avoid it just saying NATO bad, period. There's like a few thoughts about that. That's like, one is read on the neg by T, I'm not sure what your answer is anymore. The other is like the other team will just say NATO good for like 8 minutes. And it's like that kind of defeats the purpose of reading your non-topical affirmative that tried to avoid some of the big policy strategies that you didn't want to debate, right? So it's like part of it is the thing that you want to focus on is not just NATO is bad, but debating about NATO is bad. And the difference is like, it needs to also be willing to say like just saying NATO bad on the AF is not enough, right? So it's like, if I'm thinking about some of this like technology stuff, it's like, it's not just saying emerging technology is bad. It's also talking about the way in which technology has been seeped into debate. So it's like the way in which we debate some of these technology issues are bad. Or like if your argument is about the white Atlantic, it's like the argument is not like NATO bad necessarily. It's more like the assumption that sort of Atlantic inquiry should only focus on Europe, and oftentimes NATO bad and good arguments are focused on what would European states do. Yeah, it's like that debate is bad and that needs to be more extensive. So that's kind of the approach that you need to be able to take. Do you have a question? Totally fine. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I didn't really start with books, which maybe was a mistake, but I definitely kind of started with like Google Scholar stuff. So it's like, I kind of started by being like, because I sort of had some foreknowledge that's like this white Atlantic, black Atlantic stuff existed. So I was just like, white Atlantic, Atlantic civilization, Atlantic community, like did some of those things in Google Scholar, and like found that there were a bunch of people who talked about not just the white Atlantic, but different kinds of versions of Atlantic history. And I was like, okay, like that's kind of interesting. Like, came to some of the CEDAW stuff, et cetera. So I would start by doing like Google Scholar searches, honestly. Not necessarily. I think like you're at Dartmouth, so like you have access to books, so you should go find some books, especially when you have time. I don't. So like at home, like I have Google Scholar. That's kind of all I got. And so like when I started this process in like March, yeah, most of the stuff was on Google Scholar as opposed to books. I'd say if I was here, I would 100% go into stacks and look for some stuff that's like history of NATO. And you sort of want to look for histories of NATO that are not just like military histories, right? It's like you want to look for books that kind of look like a social history of NATO. And by that, I mean like, what are people talking about sort of like NATO in relationship to things like colonialism, processes like, imperialism. So it's like you can kind of tell from the title of the books, you're like, oh yeah, like this book is just going to be like NATO is great for hedge. It's like, that's not really the history that you're looking for, presumably, right? So it's like, you want to sort of look for like, social histories of NATO that are usually in like philosophy sections, in sections, about sociology, and sort of like branch out from there. If that makes sense. I mean, possibly it might possibly like. I usually like. I mean, this kind of makes me like a weird old timey nerd, but like I like those old bookstores, like especially the ones around like Dartmouth that are just like random academic books. Like I would go in there and like look around and see what exists.
But it's not, there's not like one book.
If you randomly find one, then it's like that would be really cool, but like no, usually not. Like, and I think historical examples usually are just like things you kind of gain from a bunch of different books, as opposed to like, oh yeah, this is like book dash F, right? It's like that's usually like not quite the way that it works. Any other questions? Did you have another question? I feel like you did. Okay. I don't mind if it's like, you can also ask affirmative stuff that you're like thinking about for the season, and I'd be happy to be honest with you about it. So like, just out of transparency, I tend to think the topicality arguments do have some persuasive value. So like, I can tell you like what the set of negative arguments that I would think of are, and then what the set of affirmative arguments that I would think of are as well. So.
What do you think the area of persuasive arguments against the model minority type of literature is going to be on next topic?
For the neg or the F?
For the neg, like what the persuasive like negative arguments would be on that type of affirmative?
Couple things, I guess. I would say the most common set of arguments would be there will be topicality arguments. The 2AC will likely say something like topicality creates the notion of an ideal Asian debater that is a model minority, and that's bad. The neg will likely say something like topicality doesn't do that. It doesn't make referendums on like people. It just says that certain arguments are debatable or not debatable. It does not say one is more ideal or not ideal. I think like topicality is an important one. I think being able to sort of talk about how Western institutions have, limited Asian inquiry is kind of important, because otherwise I think it's hard for you to establish like white topicality is the thing that establishes the model minority, as opposed to just like, debate in general that you might not solve. So it's like topicality is in one area. I think another area would be like the CAP-K, and usually the CAP-K link will be kind of nonsense, but like the impact argument will probably say something like, the myth of the model minority comes from the idea of meritocracy and capitalism, i.e. agents who are harder working are then assimilated into white society and are successful, versus other, agents who were not successful at assimilating are considered, not sufficiently Asian and or not sufficiently white either. Right. So it's like the root cause argument is like pretty okay. So it's like in that world, it's like you want to make sure you have answers to link arguments, and then answers to, you sort of want for the CAP-K, another sort of history deep dive thing. You should think about sort of like the historical examples of intersections between Marxists and Asian folks, for example. So it's like, one example would be like Yuri Kochiyama is like an example of a very famous like Marxist who, was of Japanese descent and had relationships with like the Black Panther Party. You might also think of examples that are not just term examples, but like alt takeout examples. So like, where has the intersection of Marxism and Asian folks gone wrong? Right. So it's like you have some examples of Asian folks who, were excluded because of a certain, for some certain situation from Marxist groups. And it's like, can you generate a set of impact arguments from that is probably another set. TCAP, I would say the other one that I would say is particularly threatening is probably like Afro-pessimism. And I would try to sort of find a set of articles that describes the importance of talking about Asianness, because most of the Afro-pessimism versions of the response to the model minority critique is like, Asians are not sort of your structural antagonism, like it largely is a conflict. And so we need to focus on sort of the larger paradigm. So it's like you would need some cards that are just like, no, thinking about these two things in tandem is really important. And like, that's kind of the way that you would push back. Yeah. Has to start with the article. So it's like, I don't think you can start by being like, I think this is my advocacy, and then here's the 1AC. It's usually kind of impossible. So it's like, you want to start by looking for like, so it's like once you've looked for historical examples and you're like looking for a solvency advocate, you want to sort of think about what is the scope of the thing I'm describing in the app. So like, to say it bluntly, right? It's like, it would be pretty weird if the scope of your affirmative was like, NATO is a really bad organization, imperialism causes extinction. And then your solvency argument was like, we just do this one thing in debate. It's like, it's kind of weird because it's like one thing you do in debate has zero relationship to whether you stop imperialism, right? So it's like, if your AF is more about like the debate community, it makes sense that your solvency arguments are about debate, right? It's like, that matches pretty well. If your argument is more about sort of like the global, then it's like you need some argument that's a solvency argument that's like the things we do in debate can connect to a set of global movements, right? So it's like, let's say the AF is like, we have this larger criticism of both the US and Russia and NATO and all of these international players. It's like, I might have an alternative that's like, we need to have a more cosmopolitan understanding of movements. We need to defend like a popular front, like the Ukrainian peace movement that exists as a piece of evidence too. Like we need to defend that and sort of Ukrainian anarchism as opposed to any nation state formation. It's like NATO good, bad is not the debate. The debate is popular front, right? So it's like, you want something that matches the scope of your impact argument so you can more readily avoid some of this like vote negative presumption kind of push. Yeah. AF or neg. I think I would have a case frontline that probably had a couple of things. I would have a presumption argument that says that your thing doesn't do anything really and doesn't leave the debate. I would likely have some arguments that say that you should not compete over the thing, so the burden of rejoinder is bad. So specifically, that would mean like, why is your thing something that should be negated? Like even if it's a good idea. So like, think about if your AF is like, just like, oh yeah, we need to like invest, like NATO is really bad. It's like, why is it good for the neg to come up and say NATO good? Right. So it's like, you might be like, the structure of debate makes it a poor place to sort of debate some of these performative arguments. You might also have some arguments about like the not successful nature of said performance, depending on what it is. So like, if your performance is related to like visibility of certain populations, it's like, you might be like, well, visibility is bad, right? It's like, it is engaging with sort of the reason why, the thing it's saying is good or bad, right? So it's like, that would be kind of the set of front lines I would make. And then finally, I might have some stuff specific to an author that's easy, not as easy as it sounds, but it's like, there are some things that get recycled year after year. So it's like, if it's going to be Deleuze, it's like, I'm probably just going back at the, whatever Deleuze answers that I have, and I'm putting the rest in the 1NC, right? It's like, that's kind of the way that I would kind of approach the writing of that front line. The other thing that you want to think about when writing the front line is that your front line needs to match the off case position that you really want to go for. So it's like the set of things that's like, oh yeah, critiques are terrible and don't do anything, they don't solve. And then like you going for the cap K is like tough because it's like, well, you also are going for a K. So like, what are you doing? Right. Or like if your thing is like, yeah, like, we're reading after pessimism and like the case debate is like state good. It's like, yeah, it's like, what are we really going for here? It's like, you want to make sure that things match. So it's like topicality arguments, oftentimes, if you're going for fairness, match really well with like this in competition actually use counterproductive. Like that is a thing that like traces really well. Or if your capitalism K is like state phobia, it's like the cards that are like the state's really important to solve X issue works pretty well, right? It's like, so it's like, you want to make sure the case arguments you're going for are commensurate with what your 2NR strategy is likely going to be. Yeah.
Okay, how successful do you think critiques about a specific type of
In my opinion, not very, unless they are tied to the way in which we debate. So if it's just like, for example, like, one of the AFs that somebody thought about for like this topic is like a gene bank, and you're like, gene banks are bad. It's like, what's likely going to come back is they're going to be like topicality, and then they'll say, you don't have to defend gene banks. Like there's two other parts of the topic and also other kinds of biotechnology, right? So it's like, that's pretty tough. Now, caveat is, I think there's a version of that affirmative that maybe is not just focused on that specific technology, but talks about sort of it in relationship to technologies in debate, right? So it's like, let's say your biotechnology app, so like the borderization one is a good example. It's like you have a set of things that you're talking about that are problematic borderization, but it's not just limited to the idea of borderization. There's a larger concept of fortress Europe. There's a larger concept of just borderization and intellectual inquiry, right? So it's like you have a critical affirmative that answers more than just like, so it can't just be like, this is, I think the difference is you can't just have an AF that's like, this is a case snag to a different AF, right? So like, it can't be like, this is just drones bad. It's like, okay, like you don't have to defend drones, like, you know. So like, you don't want to get beyond that route, but it's like, as long as you can connect it to sort of a larger thing, you're in a better place. Yeah, like I think I would like, there's definitely a set of articles that talk about, I want to say like chivalrous conduct in the context of international relations that people have talked about in relationship to NATO. There's also some cards that like I know exist out there that are about, I forgot who I want to say it's like the Women and International Popular, it's like WILPF or something like that. There's an organization that literally posts constantly about NATO, which is like a women's rights organization that's global and is like, NATO sucks. And they have been producing articles in 2022. So like you should, it's like WILPF, it's like mix some of those acronyms together. I don't quite remember what it is, but it's like it exists. So it's like, yes, that is totally fine. Your AF can't just be like, we are a feminist criticism of genome rings, however, because then they'll just be like, defend anything else, right? And so you want to make sure you have a larger criticism that then, you know, also isn't just NATO bad, but is like debating about NATO at all, good, bad, is no bueno. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay. Okay. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Like I say that, like there are definitely Buddhists who write about peace building, international relations. I know like this now like reaches kind of pretty far, but like there's a person named like Fershak that writes about international relations in Buddhism, and I'm pretty sure it says the word security cooperation in NATO. But like it exists. I think the thing to sort of think about is when I was like, don't start with a theory, it doesn't mean you can't start with like a larger area of study. So it's like, the thing that I would avoid is being like, Wilderson, this is what I do. So it's just going to be Wilderson, and we shoved it in, right? It's like, but like generally being like, I'm interested in Black studies. I'm interested in like Eastern religion. It's like, there are a number of different ways that people talk about a number of those things, right? So it's like, I think that's fine to be like, I'm really excited about a certain area of study, but I just wouldn't commit to a certain author before you went into a debate or you went into. Yeah. I mean, I would imagine that people are probably less ready to debate that. So yeah, and like I think that would be pretty interesting. I do think like some of the Buddhism, etc., like that kind of spirituality stuff does exist. It's pretty, I wouldn't say common, but like exists. The thing that I would watch out for there most is probably a set of critiques of capitalism. You know, similar quote, I would remember, you know, religion is the opiate for the masses kind of style of response, where people are just like, spirituality is a way to move away from material discomforts, and so that makes revolution less likely. I think that the AF has quite a few answers, / there is a relationship between, for example, Buddhism and socialism and communism. But it's like, yeah, there would be like a, you know, interesting debate about that. Any other questions? Cool. Well, if you have any critical AF ideas or thoughts or questions that you might have, you can feel free to email me at any point. I'm usually pretty good about responding. So, yep. Enjoy lunch.